As the carriage crawled to a halt, a man in the street yelled to the cab driver that his fare had just jumped from the carriage and was running through the street. Annoyed, thinking he was going to be cheated from his fare, the cab driver jumped down to inspect the carriage. But when he looked inside, he couldn't believe what he was looking at, and he knew he needed help. On the evening of the 26th of February 1889, around 6:40, a Mr Henry Goulding was sat waiting for a fare with his carriage outside the Manchester Cathedral. He looked up, watching the people wandering the nearby streets, when he noticed an old man talking to his younger friend and walking towards him. And as they got close, in the gathering darkness, the young man's gruff voice requested that they be taken to 3 Arrows on Deansgate, a notorious public house. As the men got out of the cab, they called back to Mr Goulding to wait for them, as they wouldn't be long and just had business to take care of. Henry was uneasy, as nearly all these notorious public houses had other means of escape, secret tunnels or back doors into the dark warren of slum alleyways, just in case someone needed to make a getaway from the law, or worse. He lit his white clay pipe that he had held clenched in his teeth, clutching the bowl of the pipe as the flame gave him a brief warmness in the chilly February evening. As the light of the flame lit his face, he kept his gaze fixed on the windows and doors of the 3 Arrows. After about 20 minutes later, both men came back out and climbed into the cab. As Henry climbed back to his seat and took the reins, he heard the voice of the younger man again, who demanded to be taken to 43 Stretford Road. Henry did as he was bid without fuss, guiding the horse along Deansgate, down Peter Street and across the road to where it turns to Oxford Street. But then the carriage ground to a crawl, as they were surrounded by a large crowd who had gathered to watch a circus parade, and all the routes seemed blocked. Just then, the man in the crowd started waving and shouting at Henry, "Your mans are fleeing!" Henry turned and looked to see the back of the young man. He had jumped out of the carriage and was running down the street. Henry jumped down to check if the older man had run with his comrade. He moved closer to the open door of the carriage and looked inside the cab. Henry found the older man sat alone on the back seat, with his head slumped forward towards the front seat. Henry shook the man and tried to rouse him, saying, "Hey, are you okay?" But the older man told him to go away, seemingly drunk or insensible, seemingly slipping in and out of consciousness. Anxious that he wouldn't get paid for his fare, Henry decided to return back to the cathedral, where he first picked up the men, in hoping to find a police officer. On arriving, Henry found Police Constable Jackman. Henry explained what had occurred, and he hoped he could be assisted in obtaining the fare that was rightly due to him. The officer also agreed the older man was in a drunken state, and told the cabman to drive to the near Albert Street police station. However, halfway through the journey, the constable became very concerned about the man, whose condition appeared to be deteriorating rapidly. He banged on the roof of the cab, calling for Henry to make for the Royal Infirmary. The carriage raced to the doors, and Constable Jackman and Henry dragged the man out of the carriage and carried him towards the entrance. But as they did so, he took one last deep intake of breath and died. After taking full account of Henry's version of events and adding that with the dead body, it was classed as a suspicious death, and Detective Caminada was placed in charge of the case. Jerome Caminada was a bit of a super cop, a real-life Sherlock Holmes, who also kept a diary about his crime-fighting days, describing in detail the cases, suspects and victims. When given the case, Caminada had no clues or evidence of any sort, but he got to work immediately, showing why he was respected and so widely known across the city. Looking through the police report, Caminada found Constable Jackman noted, quote, that the deceased's clothing looked as though it had been interfered with, and there was only a small amount of change on him, when from his appearance it seemed to be a gentleman who would have more cash with him, end quote. Also, when Caminada looked at the body, he noticed from marks on the bridge of the nose that he wore spectacles, and although he had 2 spectacle cases in his pockets, The spectacles themselves, which Caminada subsequently learnt to be gold-rimmed, were nowhere to be found. Caminada was now convinced that the deceased was a victim of foul play, but with still no evidence, the case couldn't even be classed as a murder. Caminada first needed to identify who the two men were. The morning after, in the police station, while sorting through the victim's possessions, the police found a checkbook from the Manchester and Southport Bank, and through this they found the victim was 50-year-old John Fletcher, who was a paper manufacturer who had lived in Birkdale near Southport. He had come to Manchester the day before to attend the sale of a mill at the Mitre Hotel. He left his office in Cannon Street at 1 p.m, and his nephew, John Robert Fletcher, told Caminada that his uncle had in his possession a wallet containing £5, a gold pocket watch and chain, and had also been wearing a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. He spent the afternoon in the Mitre Hotel, where he was seen by several business associates who knew him well. He left later, saying that he was heading to Sinclair's Oyster Rooms on Deansgate for something to eat. Caminada followed up on these clues and found Edward Late, who had a dried fish and game stall near to the Sinclairs. Late knew the deceased, and at some time after 6 p.m. on the night in question, he had noticed him in conversation with the younger man, whose identity he did not know. The older man appeared to have been having a drink. Next, Detective Caminada went to the Three Arrows public house, 98 Deansgate, where the landlady, Mary Elizabeth Frost, confirmed that she had seen the two men fitting the descriptions given to her in her public house on the evening of the 26th of February about 7 p.m. However, she had not taken much notice of what they had done or said and could not help any further. Caminada decided to trace the owner of 43 Stretford Road where the cab was told to go, which was a locked tailor's shop, with no one knowing who the young man was. On the 1st of March, the inquest of John Fletcher opened before the city's deputy coroner, Sidney Smelt. A post-mortem had been performed by Dr. John Barker, house physician at the Royal Infirmary. Charles Escourt, the city analyst, had been sent 3 sealed jars, one of which was labelled contents of upper parts of small intestines, another stomach contents of Mr. Fletcher, and the third was labelled fluid from the abdominal cavity, removed Friday, March 1st at 2 p.m, case Mr. Fletcher. The analyst had not completed his investigations, and following formal evidence of identification, the inquest was adjourned to allow the police to make further investigations. However, Caminada was provided with an advance notice of the analyst's findings and the post-mortem. Nothing could be found, no marks on the body or poisons, although one of the tests he performed was in search for chloroform, which results from the decomposition of coral hydrate. Caminada was thus aware that traces of chloral, a colourless liquid used as a sedative, had been found, which piqued his interest as he remembered reading a crime report sent by the Liverpool police of a theft and a quantity of chloral on Tuesday, 19th of February, from a chemist shop. This couldn't be a coincidence, as the description of the thief seemed to match that of the younger man in this current case. Caminada rushed to interview the chemist, a Mr. Charles Bromley, who told him that a young man entered his shop around 6:30 p.m. and had asked for 40 grains of hydrate of chloral. Mr. Bromley then asked for a prescription, which the customer could not provide, but insisted that he needed it for his mother, who was suffering. The chemist, taking pity, agreed to provide him with a smaller amount, but just then the young man reached over the counter and grabbed the jar of hydrate of chloride before running out of the shop. Several witnesses gave the same description of the man. He was 5 foot 4 inches high, he was clean shaven, and he was wearing a light check suit. Caminada knew this was relatively little to go on, but he had a major break when he was informed the man who had alerted the cab driver that the individual had jumped from the carriage wanted to speak with him. The witness informed the detective that after doing so, he had run towards All Saints Church. The detective raced to the area to make inquiries. One place he went to was a beer house called York Minster on Higher Chatham Street. Here, the landlord, Andrew Halt, described how the young man had arrived around 7 p.m. on the night in question. He told the detective he had a golden pocket watch on a chain, and when he was paying for his drink, he pulled out a large sum of money. The young man was now a suspect for the robbery, at the very least, and possibly of murder. Andrew said the young man left the pub by cab, and he knew who the driver was and where he could be found. His name was William Coleman, and Caminada wasted no time in locating him. The driver remembered the young man very well. Flashing a lot of cash, he took the young man to the Locomotive Inn on Oldham Road. This was a place the detective knew very well, and its landlord, John Parton, also known as Pig Jack. Before taking over the Locomotive Inn, Pig Jack had run a notorious beer house in Greengate, Salford. He was well known amongst Manchester's underworld and the boxing fraternity. It was also been rumoured that he had been known to put a drug in the water used by his fighters' opponents, so improving his odds on his bets, and furthermore, he is also said to have spiked the drinks of some of his customers to rob them. The detective knew John Pig Jack Parton did not fit the description of John Fletcher's companion, but Caminada reasoned that perhaps one of his sons had decided to use his knowledge of the use of drugs as an aid to robbery. Tracing the description of the young man to 12 Moore Street off Rochdale Road, he found 18-year-old Charles, and at 12:30 a.m. on the morning of 2nd of March, Caminada and his colleague Inspector Wilson went to the house and arrested the suspect. Typical of the time, the young man had little education and was a messenger in a Manchester hotel. However, he did not keep his job for long, and since he had little experience of work, he was let go. Charles, though, showed some expertise in boxing and spent a brief spell in America where he tried to make some headway in the sport. Charles also had a criminal record, having been convicted of stealing from the hotel in Market Harborough, for which he received 6 months in prison sentence. He had also been convicted of defrauding a railway company at Stockport. At the police station, a number of identity parades were held, using several witnesses that helped place the young man at the cathedral, in the Three Arrows, jumping from the cab, in the York Minster, and being taken by cab to the Locomotive Inn, and also as the person who stole the collar roll from the chemist shop in Liverpool. Things were now looking bleak for Charles, and Detective Caminada charged the young man with having stolen from John Fletcher a gold watch and chain valued at £120 and an unknown sum of money. Charles declared himself to be innocent and told the detective that he had been at the coursing meeting in Liverpool that day and had returned home at 6 p.m, after which he had stayed indoors. On the morning of the 4th of March, Parton was brought before the City Police Court charged with robbery and also on suspicion of having caused death of John Fletcher. A huge amount of public and press interest helped the case, as 2 apparent earlier victims of Parton contacted him. On the 8th of January 1889, Samuel Oldfield of Ashton visited Manchester and was later found in a stupefied and apparently drunken state, minus his watch valued at £10 and his cash. At the time, the police did not believe his story of being drugged and followed. The following morning, he received a fine for being drunk. Another came forward was John Parky, who on the 28th of December 1888 had been robbed of his watch and chain together with some cash, after apparently being drugged. Each of the men independently identified the prisoner as a young man who was with them at the time of the drugging. Charles Parton's trial opened on Monday 18th of March 1889 at St George's Hall, Liverpool, where he faced a charge of murdering John Fletcher and of stealing his property. He was also charged with additional matters relating to Samuel Oldfield and John Parky. The trial was the first case in which Collarol had allegedly been used to murder a victim. As the case progressed, the defence did their best to discredit the witnesses, but Detective Caminada had done such a thorough job collecting evidence, witnesses and motive, it had become an open and shut case. Also, what made things worse for Charles, the press released what a family friend John Whittaker had said. In a visit to the prisoner Charles, who was awaiting trial, he said that Parton had made some incriminating remarks. Apparently, he had said that he knew John Fletcher from when he was a youngster and had previously worked in the city centre hotel. The older man had sometimes stayed there, and on the 26th of February they had got into a conversation and agreed to have a drink together. Parton had indeed intended to drug and rob him, but quickly realised he had given him too much, and that he was, quote, a goner. He had returned to the cab with a specific intention of jumping out as soon as possible. In the end, it took the jury just 20 minutes to decide a guilty verdict, but with a strong recommendation for mercy. However, the judge sentenced him to death in the normal manner and warned him that he could not guarantee that the jury's recommendation would be agreed to. And rather ominously, he warned the prisoner to prepare himself for death. A Dr. Gumber of Manchester wrote an attack on the city's analyst's findings, which was published in the British Medical Journal shortly after the trial ended. Dr. Gumber was adamant a murder had not taken place, and he criticised the criminal justice system, in which he claimed they had rushed to judgment, pointing out that from the moment of John Fletcher's death to the sentence of death being imposed, insufficient time had elapsed to have allowed for an adequate scientific investigation to have taken place. He continued by saying that he considered it wholly inappropriate for only one chemical analysis to have been made. However, even if reliance was put on Charles Estcourt's findings, the trace of cholesterol was not sufficient to have caused or contributed in any way to the death of John Fletcher, who was more likely to have died of alcohol poisoning. Charles Estcourt wrote a rebuttal, and the views of Dr. Gumber were published too late to have a bearing on the trial. However, his article had raised some serious doubts about the case, and as a result, several politicians wrote to Parton's solicitors in support of a reprieve. In all, more than 3,000 signatures were collected in Manchester and Liverpool in support of a reprieve, and his solicitor, Mr. William Burton, presented the petition personally to the Home Secretary in early April. However, there remained a substantial section of the press and public who believed that a reprieve would send out the wrong message to others who might be tempted to use drugs in robberies, and that this was a case in which a deterrent sentence was called for. So on Saturday the 6th of April, Charles's mother, father and 6 siblings arrived at 2:30 at Kirkdale Jail, in time for their son and their brother's execution. Just then, a warden walked over to them, and they feared the worst, thinking they had already missed it, but to their surprise and relief, they were told that Charles had got a reprieve, but only his mother and father could see him before he would start his life sentence. Before they left their son, he told them, if he ever got released, he would move out to the American West. Well, that'll do it for today. If you enjoyed this, do let me know in the comments below. And do check out Jerome Caminada's memoirs. They were actually published when Parton was still in prison. And if you have a story, do let me know. And if I use it, I will credit you. So until next time, see you then.